Worldwide, protests have been organized demanding justice for Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Breonna Hill, and Tony McDade. Their deaths have brought great attention to the unchecked racism of the police department, and in particular, how the war on drugs targets people of color. Today, we are meeting with Ifetayo Harvey, who has been active in drug reform since 2012. She started as an intern at the Drug Policy Alliance, then founded a chapter of Students for Drugs Policy at Smith College, became the executive assistant for Rick Doblin, the founder and president for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and is now back at the Drug Policy Alliance as the marketing coordinator. Ifetayo's expertise lies at the unique intersection of drug policy reform, prison abolition, and psychedelics. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us what brought you to the work you do in drug reform and prison abolition?
Sure. So I grew up with my father incarcerated. When I was 4, my dad was convicted of a drug offense and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And because my father was an immigrant from Jamaica, he was deported shortly after he was released from prison. So I grew up knowing that, and that forced me to kind of understand the impact of the war on drugs very early on in my life. But it wasn't until I came across the Drug Policy Alliance's website that I really found the language to articulate how that whole experience was damaging for my development as a child, and looking at the larger picture, how 1 in 9 Black children will have a parent in prison. I found out about the Drug Policy Alliance, and it was the first organization that I came across that had language that was compassionate towards people who used drugs or were drug involved. And so that really struck me, because for so long I had carried a lot of shame and stigma around my experience of my dad. And it really affirmed me in a way that I didn't realize. And so I got an internship with the Drug Policy Alliance, and I began writing about my story, about my dad being incarcerated and how that impacted me. So I wrote an op-ed that was titled "Children of the Incarcerated Bear the Brunt of the War on Drugs." I ended up being invited to speak at the International Drug Policy Reform Conference in Denver 2013. I did the keynote there, and I shared more about my experience growing up with a parent in prison. And afterwards, I was approached by so many people who had a similar experience. And these are people from all backgrounds: women, men, white people, Black people, Asian. It made me realize how much of a problem this is in our society. So
the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Can you share some more statistics and why you think these statistics are so high?
I think the statistic I shared earlier was 80% of the people incarcerated in federal prisons for drug offenses are Black or Latino. And so that statistic is very stark, and it shows the racial disparity. And, to answer your point about why that is, the war on drugs, was started by Richard Nixon officially, right? But if you go back earlier into the 20th century, you see a lot of the first drug laws, those were all targeted towards people of color. White folks had been using drugs, all those same drugs, at the same rates as folks of color, even at that time, but there was a fear of people of color using drugs. And so these early laws sought to control certain populations. And when Nixon comes into the picture, we're at a very different place than we were in the early 20th century. We're on the cusp of the civil rights movement and anti-war movement. And so because those movements were building up, the Nixon administration, along with other government officials, needed something to destabilize all those movements. They need to destabilize Black liberation. They need to destabilize anti-war. And so they came up with the war on drugs. That's what it was about. It was never about the drugs. It was never about safety or health around using drugs. It was about destabilizing our communities and our movements.
What can the drug policy reform movement do to align and support Black Lives Matters more?
In order to align ourselves with, you know, Black liberation and the Black Lives Matter movement, we have to be able to connect our issue to Black Lives Matter. And it's really not that hard because obviously the war on drugs was created to destroy Black communities, right? And so the war on drugs really fuels police brutality. It really helps perpetuate that. You know, all of these drug laws that we have, you know, around possession of drugs, drug use, drug selling, all that stuff is a system to kind of usher in what we're seeing now with like Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor. You know, Breonna Taylor was shot while she was sleeping in her home. It's not about waiting until someone gets killed and when you start speaking up for Black people, right? This is a responsibility for everyone. It's not a responsibility for Black people to make the world see our humanity and prove our worth as to why we deserve to be able to live on this planet with everyone else, right? This has to be a consistent politic within all of us. And we all have a responsibility to show up for Black lives and show up for Black liberation. So when I say it needs to be a politic, I mean it needs to be a practice for everyone. And this cannot just be the work of Black people. This has to be the work of white people too. Like white people have to commit themselves to anti-racism and also commit themselves to dismantling whiteness. And like I said, it's not going to happen overnight. This has to be long-term work. It's going to continue on for years. And so, you know, I'm seeing a lot of my white friends and colleagues posting online, and I know they're having conversations with their friends and family about this, but it can't just stop. You know, this is a long-term process that y'all have to commit yourselves to. So that I think that will determine whether or not this is a catalyst for long-lasting change.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.